So this is a story that's, that was told to me a long, long time ago. I fear that my time in politics preceded the birth of most of the people in this room. But the story was told to me. I was in politics in Massachusetts in the States, and the story was told to me about, it's probably apocryphal, and it may even be apocryphal about her, but anyway, that's the way it stuck with me. The story is about a female politician in Massachusetts by the name of Louise De Hicks. And she got famous very briefly because she was against the desegregation of the Boston schools. She got elected, she was chairman of the school committee, she got elected to one term in Congress. But she also ran for Attorney General of Massachusetts. This is a story about her campaign for Attorney General. In Massachusetts, the party primaries are in September, which means that politicians have to campaign in the summer when no one cares about politics. And it's a very hard thing to do. And so she was running in the Democratic primary for Attorney General. And she was going to a meeting of several Democratic committees that had a joint meeting in order to get more people there. I've always pictured this as in one of these white clapboard buildings in Western Massachusetts with black shutters and a typical kind of New England venue. And Louise walked in the back of the room, and there were all these chairs, like the number of chairs in this room lined up, and there was only one person sitting in the front row. The only person in the room. And Louise was never one to lose her cool. She was a quite formidable woman. And she walked down the center aisle, and she walked over to the podium. She took out her speech, took her glasses out, and started to read. She got about halfway down the first page, and there was one of these summer, August thunderstorms that came rattling down on the tin roof and made a ton of noise. She took her glasses off and she looked down at the lady and she said, "You know, this is ridiculous. I could just give you the speech, you could read it and send it back to me." And the lady looked up at her and said, "Lady, you go right ahead, because I'm on after you." So when I say we're glad to see you here, we're really glad to see you here. This is really a remarkable moment, I think, and I'm really building on what you've already heard this morning. But from my perspective, thinking about what this opportunity represents, what differentiates the vision for the Masa Leadership Center from most other leadership development programs that I'm aware of, is that this is not talking about individual professional development. The goal, the objective here is not to make people more skillful so that they can move up in their organization, which is what most leadership development programs are about. But the aspiration here is to enhance people's capacity to exercise leadership in the Jewish world. And that's a very different kind of aspiration. It requires a different set of perspectives, different set of skills, different set of ways of thinking about the world. In my lifetime, and I again dare say my lifetime is longer than the lifetime of anybody else in this room, as best as I can tell, I've never experienced a time like the time we're in. You can go through the litany, all the things that characterize the turbulence in which we are sitting, immersed right now globally. Climate change and technology, politics, and Jewishly. This is a remarkable, complicated time Jewishly, probably more so than I've ever experienced. So these times, the times that we're in, the rapidity of change, the characteristics, the elements have changed. War is completely different than it was 20 years ago. The politics have changed. We're worried about, I remember the first time anybody told me to worry about climate change, and my instinct was, that's something for my kids and grandkids. I don't have to worry about that. And all of a sudden, that's no longer the case. My grandkids are going to grow up never knowing a non-digital world. And they're going to learn to relate to people in ways that are different than most of us in this room have experienced. And there are consequences to that, and we don't know what they are. But what we do know, I think, is that the kind of world we live in is not going away in our lifetimes. And what characterizes that? It seems to me there are three elements. The first is change is a constant. You know, when I grew up, things were steady, right? You could anticipate big change and figure out a way to get through it. And now we're living in a period where, I don't know if your experience is the same as mine, but every day I read the newspaper or look at the news, there's something that I never, literally could not have imagined 3, 4, or 5 years ago. What we're learning about brain research, the implications of technology, what does it mean to be able to see. I have a daughter-in-law who is a very smart school teacher. She has refused to do 23andMe because she doesn't want her DNA and her to be out there somewhere. Her husband, my youngest of 3, is in the podcast business, and he gets a lot of what's the word? Stuff that they give you at conferences. What's the word? Yeah, swag, right. Yeah. He gets a lot of swag. He's gotten 3 Alexas, and she won't turn them on, right? Because it's so unclear, you know, when they're on, when they're off, what they're seeing, what they're hearing. Right? We're living in a different world, which is characterized by constant change, unpredictable futures. None of us know what it's going to look like. And we're making decisions, sometimes really important decisions, at governmental levels, at organizational levels, at personal levels, with inadequate information. We don't have enough information to make us sure about the next steps we're going to take. Constant change, uncertain future, inadequate information. So what that suggests to me is that that requires a different kind of leadership. Well, let me share with you my assumptions about leadership. 5 assumptions. The first is leadership is a behavior. It's an activity. Think of it as a verb, not as a person. I will never use the word leader, because to me, the way we use that word conjures up an image of someone, usually a man, in a big job. I don't think that's what leadership is all about. Second assumption is that leadership is a complicated issue, but it is not a technical problem. There's no textbook answer. Third assumption is that leadership is completely independent of position. Where you sit in an organization influences how you can exercise leadership, the way you exercise leadership, timing, pacing, tactics, degree of risk, and a whole bunch of things. But the opportunities for exercising leadership have nothing to do with position. In fact, my experience and observation is that the bigger the job, the less people exercise leadership. I think there are good reasons for that. Yeah? People who find themselves at the top of the organizations are not interested in putting that at risk. Right? They're not interested in any organization that puts me at the top must be fabulous, right? must have brilliant judgment, right? And so people typically, characteristically, people at the top of organizations are much more interested in preserving what they have than in leading change. And that's not an accident to me. It's not surprising to me that when we think of the iconic people who exercise leadership, people like Mother Teresa and Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, those are three folks who never had a job, right? When they did their most extraordinary acts of leadership, right? And it's not surprising to me when we think of people who did exercise leadership and had big jobs. Yitzhak Rabin, Anwar Sadat, Abraham Lincoln. They didn't end up very well. No. Because leadership is a risky and dangerous proposition. So that's the second assumption, is that the third assumption is that leadership is independent of position. The fourth assumption is that the opportunities for exercising leadership come to each of us every day. They come to you at your family dinner table. They come to you in your professional life. They come to you in your life as a student. They come to you in your social life. The only question really is whether you see those opportunities and whether you take advantage of them. And the fifth assumption that I bring to this conversation is that leadership can be learned. Now, I'm a little prejudiced on that one, since that's the way I've made my living for a long time. So I wouldn't quite trust me, but trust me. Right? Leadership is about skills. Anybody can learn any skill that is useful for exercising leadership if you're willing to work hard. Now, that doesn't mean that for some people it's not easier than others. Just like if you're 7 feet tall, it's easier for you to dunk a basketball than it is for me, right? Some people have some natural advantages, but my experience and observation is that those natural advantages can easily be overcome by people who work hard at it, right? I don't know if you had this experience, but I had this experience myself and also with my kids, that when they were growing up and playing sports, when they were very young, there were some kids who were, quote, natural athletes. Right? And then when they got to be teenagers, those natural athletes weren't the best anymore because other kids had worked really hard to develop those skills. So I think the same thing is true of leadership. The only people I know who think that people are born with leadership skills are people who think they have them. It's a pernicious idea. So those are the assumptions that I bring to this conversation. I have very high aspirations for the brief time that we have together, because I don't want to spend this time talking at you the way I did. I want to spend this time as much as we can in an engagement. So the question that I was thinking about, and talked about this with Sarah, is whether we can actually aspire not only to talk about the potential at the Masa Leadership Center, but to kind of demonstrate it, to illustrate it in real time. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions, thanks to my dear friend Ed O'Malley, who invented them. Right? So you can work along with this conversation and try to think about a leadership challenge that is facing you. Right? As we begin to talk about and think about what are the skills and what are the qualities that are required to exercise leadership in the times in which we live. So you all have notebooks in front of you and fancy pens. Right? That's our swag, right? And I want to put them to use. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like to give you a couple of minutes to write an answer to it, think about it, write an answer to it, and then we'll continue this conversation. So the first question is when you think about the future of, and you can fill in the blank. Can everybody see one of the flip charts or the other? That's the idea here. Yeah. Okay. When you think about the future of, and then fill in the blank, an organization, a community, a particular tribe that you belong to, what concerns you the most? What are you worried about? What keeps you awake at night? Okay. I'll give you a couple minutes to do that. When you think about the future of an organization, community, a tribe, a faction that you're a part of, what keeps you awake at night? We were talking, while you're doing that and thinking about it, we were talking about whether it was realistic to ask people to do real work in this kind of a context where people come assuming they're going to be talked to. And it also reminded me of a joke. The joke is about Moses and Jesus playing golf. Some people probably know this joke. This is a question of whether we can do real work. And so Moses and Jesus are playing golf, and they get up on the first tee, and Moses hits first, and he's along in years, and so he does the best he can, hits the ball, and goes about 150 yards down the center of the fairway. Nothing fabulous, but not bad, And Jesus gets up and swings the club around the back of his neck. His beard is flying all over the place. A huge swing, and the ball goes flying off into a tree, hits the tree up in the air. A hawk comes by, grabs the ball in its beak, flies over to the green, drops the ball about 3 inches from the cup, and an inchworm comes and pushes the ball into the cup. And Moses looks at Jesus and says, "Look, we're going to play golf, or we're just going to screw around." So the question is whether we can actually aspire to do some real work. So take 2 minutes. I'll give you 2 minutes more to answer this question, and then begin to talk a little bit about what are the qualities that are useful for exercising leadership in the times that we live. Okay, 30 seconds. There it is. So as you think about a world in which change is constant, the future is uncertain, and we are asked to make decisions based on inadequate information, it seems to me that the qualities, in a big picture sense, that are needed to thrive and survive and exercise leadership under those circumstances are really threefold. First of all, we need the capacity, the capability, the skill to see and face new realities, to not be in denial. The second is we need to have the courage to take responsibility for inventing the future. not expect other people to do it, or just to react to what happens. But to have the courage to take a great leap about our own sense of agency. And the third is to work against a default, which I find very prevalent in people who aspire to make a difference. And that is to work against the default of rushing to action. In our experience, the diagnostic part of leadership is both critical and undervalued. And trying to figure out what's going on here, what's really happening, instead of looking for what you know how to fix and going for that, instead of defaulting to an assumption that fits with your own worldview. Right? But to be open as you try to figure out what's really happening here, to interpretations of reality which are not going to necessarily be comfortable for you or for the people who you're working with. To begin to work on your skills of diagnosis, what's really going on here. Not what's on the surface, not what appears to be, but what would be other interpretations than the one that comes first to my mind? What would be a different way of thinking about explaining what is happening here? Okay, so now I'm going to give you the second question. What makes progress difficult on the concern that you identified in the first question? Why isn't there more progress than there is? You know, if there's a concern, if there's a worry, why hasn't more stuff happened? Why aren't things in a better place? How would you explain that? And I'm using this question right after talking about interpretation because this is a question to help you think about what is really getting in the way of progress here. What are the barriers? Give you one more minute to think about that. What is the time? It's really 20 of. Okay, 15 seconds. Okay, now I'd like to identify, to name what I think are 6 skills that are required to exercise leadership in the times that we're in, the circumstances in which we find ourselves. My assumption is, because you're here, is that this is a room full of mostly type A people. Task-oriented, get stuff done, right? How many people here are list makers? Okay. Look, I'm such... It was almost unanimous, not quite, right? I'm such a crazy list maker that sometimes I will find myself putting something on the list that I've already done so I can check it off. Right. Yeah, I see some heads nodding, right? That is really sick. Okay. So we tend to want to get stuff done. We are rewarded for getting stuff done, for going through those tasks, checking them off, right? Until the list keeps getting longer and longer, right? There's nothing wrong with being good at executing, you know. It's important work. No organization could survive, no family could survive and thrive unless there were lots of people executing stuff really well, getting stuff done, right? But in the circumstances in which we are living, that desire to execute has to be tempered, tweaked with a desire to adapt. And the process of adaptation is very different than the process of execution. Execution is essentially technical work, right? You can hire an expert to fix a car, right? But if the problem with the car is not that the brakes have worn out, but the problem with the car is that your teenagers are driving with their feet on the brakes all the time, right? The brake mechanic can't fix that problem, right? And the challenge of adaptation, what makes adaptation difficult, and if you think about it from a metaphor of biological adaptation, what the people who know that business tell me is that when a species adapts, right, very little of the DNA is changed, 6%, 8%, 10% maybe in some cases, but relatively small. So adaptation is a process basically of preservation, right? That sounds like the good news. But in a human organization, in a tribe, in a family, in an NGO, the process of adaptation means that 6% or 8% of the DNA of that organization is going to be left behind, right? And in some situations, that's real people. In some situations, it's functions that are beloved by some. In some situations, it is values that have been honored and committed to. So when an organization, when a family, when a community, when a tribe adapts to a new reality, you're really talking about making the really painful decisions about what is absolutely essential to preserve going forward and what can be left behind. What parts of what made us who we are can we give a decent burial to? And that is really, really difficult work. If you try to think about it in your own family, your own community, every one of those values, every one of those qualities, every one of those functions has people who believe in it, and that's why they come to work all day, or that's why they feel loyal, or that's why they identify. So one of the reasons, one of the ways to think about why adaptation is so difficult is it's really about distributing loss. And when we think about exercising leadership, we tend to think about the heroics. But when you're trying to exercise leadership on really difficult problems and the kind of world in which we live in, you're in the business of distributing loss. You're in the grief counseling business. And that's not typically the way we think of ourselves. So that's the first skill. And I'm not saying that we give up the capacity to execute. I'm just suggesting that that has to be tweaked and tempered with a willingness to go through an adaptive process with all the pain and the difficulty that that entails. The second related skill, instead of thinking of yourself as just a problem solver, you have to think of yourself some of the time as an experimenter. Solving problems is very different than running experiments. Most people don't like to be experimented upon. But when you're stepping into an unknown place, when you're at the frontier, when you're trying to figure out what can be left behind and what is so essential that it has to be preserved, even though it brings some risks and problems along with it. One of the ways of approaching that kind of issue is to begin to think of yourself as running experiments, trying something out. There's tremendous pressure, particularly if you're in a position of authority, to solve problems, to come up with solutions. People expect people who are in positions of authority or who are experts to have an answer, particularly to have an answer that doesn't provide any pain for them. Right? If you begin to think of yourself as running experiments, it has enormous advantages. First of all, you can run multiple experiments at the same time. You don't have to be completely invested in one idea. You can say, look, let's try this and let's try that. Second of all, you are obliged to monitor those experiments, to see what's happening, to find out all the time how it's going. Third, you can make mid-course corrections, like scientists do. Right? And fourth, there's no such thing as failure. Because when you run an experiment, whatever happens, you learn something. And then the only issue becomes whether you can tease out that learning. You can figure out what you learned from that experiment that didn't work out the way you wanted to, and then disseminate that knowledge, use that knowledge to make sure that you benefit from that experience. So the second tweak is to think of yourself in the business of not just solving problems, but also running experiments when you're stepping into an unknown place, a place that no one else has quite ever been before. You can't expect yourself, even though others expect you, to know the right answer. The most you can expect is to identify the right problem and begin to think about how you might make progress on it. Okay, third question for you. As you think about the concern you identified, and you think about the gap between the progress you'd like to see made and what has been made, try to think a little bit about what kinds of actions or attitudes or behaviors would it take to overcome those barriers. Just as you brainstorm a little bit. So you've identified this problem, then you've talked about why there's not more progress, and then as you think about, well, what would it take to make progress? What are the kind of behaviors that we haven't seen? What are the kind of actions? What are the kinds of states of mind that might unleash more progress on this concern that you identified? So I'll give you 2 minutes to do that. If you could conjure up an action behavior or state of mind that you think might break that logjam, what would it look like? What kind of activity, what kind of behavior? Not a person, but what kind of behavior? Okay, 30 seconds. The fourth quality of the 6 that I want to mention has to do with practicing more interdependence and less self-reliance. I was talking with a friend of mine who has just gotten her PhD, or EDD, I guess, and she was talking about the frustration of the group project, which was basically the thesis. There were 5 of them working together, and she was talking about the difficulty of working 5 people together. And some people were really good at writing, and some people were really good at research, and some people got more credit than others, and some people got to do the fun parts, and how difficult it was to actually think of themselves as an interdependent system rather than 5 individuals, each of whom was going to get a separate. They weren't going to get 1 EDD for the 5 of them, they were going to get 5 EDDs. And how difficult it was for them to really internalize that. Interdependence is about giving something up, giving up some autonomy, giving up some self-reliance, about tolerating decisions that might not be the same as the ones you would make, right? And to begin to think about what it would look like in your family life, in your daily life, in your professional life, in your social life, to tweak that sense of self-reliance and self-containedness with a little sauce of interdependence. What would it look like to give up some sense of your own autonomy in the interests of moving forward together? My youngest, he thinks of himself as having brought himself up. There's some truth in that, actually. And he's turned out to be an enormously self-confident and self-contained fellow, and he's very successful. He's a wonderful, wonderful guy. But there are also some constraints that image of himself has imposed on him. For example, he doesn't like to have a boss. And he doesn't particularly like to be a boss. Right? And his autonomy is an enormously high value for him, and it has made it difficult for him to work in organizational life. Right? So that's the fourth. The fifth. Did I skip the third? So we have adapt, run experiments, practice independence. You're right. Okay. Thank you. I hadn't skipped anything. I just skipped a number. Yeah. It's good. It's good. At least counting. The fourth is to orchestrate conflict rather than just resolve it. My favorite metaphor for this idea is how many have ever experienced being a parent and having your 2 kids two of your kids fighting with each other. And your instinct, or my instinct certainly, is to go and find out whose fault it was, who started it, who was the jerk. Right? And the problem with that is that once you decide that, then the issue, whatever the issue is, no longer the issue, but you're the issue. Right? Once you use your authority to resolve conflict with subordinates, with peers, right, then you become the issue. The question then is not, was this a good or bad decision? But the question is, where do I stand in relationship to mom or dad? Right? Where do I stand in relationship to this boss? Right? So beginning to think of conflict not as an opportunity to solve the problem, but as an opportunity for you to manage the conflict so you can understand what the deeper issues really are that are producing the conflict. How many of you have ever been in a situation where people came to you and said that they had a personality conflict? Okay. My experience, I spent 3 years working for the governor of Massachusetts, where my job was personnel and politics. And one of my jobs was to resolve conflicts between senior members of the administration, cabinet officials. I actually didn't know that was part of my job until one morning the Boston Globe had a front page story about a conflict between two cabinet secretaries. And when I got to the office, the first call I got was from the governor. And my office was right below his in the State House in Boston. And he said, "Come up here." So I came up and he said, "How did that story happen in the Globe?" And I said, "Well, I guess these two folks are not getting along." And he said, "Your job is to make sure there's never another story like that during the time you're here." Oh, because it's always, I don't know if you've had experience, but hiring interviews are just blowing smoke, right? You never know what your job is until you think you're doing your job, and then someone tells you, "Ooh, that's not your job," right? Then you begin to find out what you were really hired for. Anyway, that's a. But the point is, I then began to be in the business of conflict resolution. Whenever I heard a rumor that people weren't getting along, I would call them into my office. And my first instinct, as I described it with the kids thing, was to try to figure out who was the good guy and who was the bad guy here, who had screwed up and who was being a jerk. And then what I realized is that when you began to listen to the story, and I mean this literally, every personality conflict was really a mask for an underlying value conflict. People can tolerate really, really obnoxious behavior in colleagues and peers if they think they are aligned on values and purpose. And so it is my experience that personality conflicts are virtually all the time a signal of a value conflict. And trying to understand what that value conflict is and trying to think about what's really going on here is part of the work of dealing with conflict rather than just calming it down and fixing it. When people come to you and say, "We can't get along," right? Their deepest fear is that you will say, "Oh, that's really interesting. There's a conference room over there. Go into that conference room and work this out, and I'm going to lock the door, and I'll keep shoving pizzas under the door until you've got it resolved." You know? Because they would much prefer to have you resolve it for them, take that work off their shoulders, then you become the issue rather than the conflict becomes the issue, and they don't have to do the work. So begin when you see conflict. Begin to think of yourself, not all of the time, but some of the time, as in the business of trying to manage it and orchestrate it and find out what's really going on here, rather than fixing it, rather than resolving it. Okay. So now we're on the 5th, right? Is that right? Yes. Okay. So the 5th is about beginning to think about inventing next practices rather than looking for best practices. In organizational life, in my experience, there is a tremendous tendency to say, well, what's worked somewhere else? Let's not reinvent the wheel. And what that does is take responsibility off of you to try to figure out what is distinctive about the situation you're dealing with. And how is it different from that that's worked somewhere else, rather than can we just adopt something that's worked somewhere else? Taking the responsibility for inventing next practices rather than looking for best practices is courageous work. Because people would rather try something that they can say has worked somewhere else, even if it doesn't apply to you, than take the responsibility for figuring it out themselves. Okay, and before I go to the last one, let me give you the last question to work on. This is the one that's kind of yucky. What makes that kind of leadership, the kind of leadership you identified in question 3, those kinds of attitudes, behaviors, or actions, difficult for you personally? Why haven't you done more of what you wrote about in question 3? Why is this hard for you personally? What are the fears? What are the concerns? Or to frame it in a more provocative way, what is holding you back from exercising more leadership than you have in the past on a problem that you've identified that you care deeply about? It's up there. Yeah. Thirty more seconds. So the purpose of this exercise is to make sure you don't get a good night's sleep tonight. But it's also to illustrate two things. One, it's to illustrate the kind of work that the Masa Leadership Center is undertaking. And second, to try to illustrate in this very short time frame that we have together that leading deep change, leading systems change, is very personal work. It's not individual work, but it's very personal work. And that brings me to the last of the 6 behaviors that I think are required in the times in which we're living in. And it's a kind of peculiar way to end this conversation. So, good night, Jim. And that is, rather than sacrificing your body for the cause, rather than bowing to all the pressures on you to do more, spend more time, be available on the weekends, it is your responsibility to take care of yourself. No one else is going to do that for you. And when you signal to the world that you're willing to take on more responsibility, you're willing to do more of the hard work that nobody else wants to do, you're willing to answer emails on the weekends, then the world is going to take advantage of that. If you're going to try and save whatever part of the Jewish world that you care deeply about, if you're going to try to do the work of leadership and make progress on really daunting, difficult issues, then you have to bring your A game. And you can't bring your A game if you're exhausted, if you don't eat right, if you don't exercise, if you don't get love and affection that every human being needs in appropriate ways, right? And it's your job to take care of yourself. You owe that to yourselves, and I think you owe that to the part of the Jewish world that you want to do something about. So the work of the Masa Leadership Center is as noble work as there is on the face of the earth, in my view. And this difference between trying to exercise leadership as a matter of individual professional development and trying to exercise leadership to change the systems is all the difference in the world. So I am privileged to be part of this conversation, to be here with you, and to be excited at the prospects and the challenges and the opportunities. I say this to all of the people who are in positions of authority, as well as to everybody who's sitting in this room. Keep me posted. Thank you very much. Thank you.